This is Modern Gaming Culture. This series will attempt to highlight the phenomenon of PC, console, and mobile gaming and bring to light all of its phenomenal aspects. Let's take a dive together into the world of modern gaming and take apart its structure. Now, here's your host, Rotimi Osagi. All right, this is Modern Gaming Culture. This is episode 28, Modern Gaming Culture. Continuing with unpacking times which I consider us living in, which is internet dark age and the emergence of what I call the internet bully. So using this description, your consideration for this series. And I feel like we've been on a good pace, right? Don't want this. Well, again, with material like this is such extensive material, so it's not necessarily a series I think is going to be completed, you know, in a timely fashion, so to speak. Right? This series might take a couple months to conclude because with the show length and all that, um, this is not a show episode series. That's going to be a few episodes, like with League of Legends Workflow series. You know, this is very extensive. I think I want to start putting together some material um, to use throughout the episodes too. But I feel like it's going to get kind of unwieldy because, um, with so much material, right? And then with the episodes, not being that long, right? It's not necessarily going to feel um, very good if I, try to interject a lot of material. So I've been trying to just really get people to listen to what I'm trying to say, right? Not necessarily actually trying to format it in a way where you will really have, a worldview open up for you, right? Because again, this show is not, again, I talk about how this show doesn't represent me, you know, turning on, my camera and microphone and, just saying what's on my mind, right? You know, um, you know, that, this show, I did months of preparation just for the show alone, right? Um, and it's not something where you can just come in and then just hinge on every single word I said, right? I talk about how internet radio was a very budding field, right, in the early 2010s to mid 2010s, and you know through what I call the internet censorship wave, a lot of people who were um, conducting business um, as internet radio show hosts, if you will, right, um, were pretty much taken off the internet, right? And so it was a very deliberate and very calculated campaign that they conducted. It wasn't necessarily, a runaround. It was it was just completely just wiping these people out, right? Just taking their accounts out. So you have to really understand that, what happened was not necessarily something so critical to really grasp. You know, what happened was that people who were technologically illiterate, right, were deplatformed, right, and you know didn't really understand what happened, and so as a result, again, we're not talking about people who are, you know, these are not people who just walk among us. These are people who are part of organizations, societies, etc., that we're not part of, right? And so it's not something where you can, somehow um, piece together a worldview related to how these people operate simply by just, trying to, really set a goal, right? And then try to somehow obtain it, right? Which is essentially how most people participate in the game arena, right? Um, you have to really dig deep, and that's what I've been trying to get people to do, right? So these shows have been pretty short, right? Particularly because mainly the platform is TikTok for starters. So I can't necessarily make, presentation style length content because TikTok only supports up to 60 minutes, right? Because it's very deliberate method of controlling the flow of information, right? Or censorship, if you will, right? So it's not something where you're going to get, a very extravagant, really well done material um, from me, right? From the show, right? People have really pioneered, not necessarily pioneered. I take that back. A slip of the tongue. Um, because these are not necessarily people who deserve credit to really even characterize their efforts in any such way. You know, you because these days you have AI, right, which is what's doing the censorship on TikTok, for example, right? Um, and then you have you know um bad actors who will just go out of their way and censor people, right? Out of mischievous reasons, right? Um, and then you just have your just typical trash that you find in society, right? And so it's not necessarily something where you can really give these people credit. So I don't want to give these people credit where credit is not due, right? Vertical videos, it's something that has been facilitated through a lot of social media features, such as stories, right? Reels, right? Um, and again, because people are not trying to compete, right, in this industry, and it's very difficult to compete. I'm not gonna, knock people who are part of software developing communities, right? It's not something where you're going to get, very competitive. Um, and it's not like I don't feel like I have the authority to speak on this. But it's you're not gonna get, social media that's going to really wow you, right? Um, without it being a, you know, imperative set by the masses to really get that going, right? You've had a lot of campaigns where people are trying to get stuff off the ground, and help is just not received, and so it doesn't get done, right? Um, and so you know, with using this platform, right, TikTok, etc., right, just have to be cognizant that um, it's not going to be something so. I mean, it is already, right? My efforts have been unparalleled, right? When it comes to really getting the word out through the arena of gaming. Um, but you're not going to get, high level, high production value, right? Producers, multiple camera angles, right? I'm trying to do my best, of course, by, really trying to, with pre-production and then self-producing and then post-production, right? Really try to do the best I can, right? And I feel like, of course, I've really pioneered, self-producing, like no other, quite frankly, right? Since this is the medium by which I have um, conducted internet publishing, right? And so, I do consider myself, um, the, premier self-produce, internet publisher, right? But if you think that somehow, I'm gonna somehow, you know, um, put out some of the material that some of these, you know, um, spiritual teachers, you know, um, journalists, etc., right? I mean, you're out of your mind, right? So, um, you know, so I want to do a little bit of housekeeping before I get into material, right? So, um, I've been teasing that I'm going to be doing, deck profile series, VGC team profile series, making a lot of headway. With respect to those projects, um, with VGC, I want to assess VGC a lot more because there's been a lot of changes in VGC when it comes to just the direction it's going, right? And then also with audience, etc., right? And so I want to do a lot of assessing with VGC before I start to formulate, um, put together a team profile series. And then for deck profiles, it's resources, right? It's not something where I could just dish out $6,000 and just shrug it off, right? Because again, with a lot of this stuff, again, I have so many upgrades I need to do, and I'm just gonna put them on the back burner, quite frankly, because it's not something where I do this professionally. I'm not a tech guy, right? I have a very colossal skill set when it comes to tech, for sure. Don't get me wrong, right? But I am not a tech guy by any stretch of the imagination, right? I can definitely navigate, the tech field, and if I really wanted to, I could step up my tech skills. Probably, would want to step up, my skills related to software, um, more than actual assembly, troubleshooting, debugging, etc. Um, but and then also with hardware and stuff like that. But it's not something urgent, right? Definitely, getting a lot more product under my belt is definitely more urgent for sure, right? Since when it comes to what I call conducting internet oversight, right, and then also what I call participating in the game arena, these things require you know, um, you know, um, new products, right? So that's a lot more urgent than um, you know, upgrading my tech, right? I could definitely, you know, get a couple more monitors, probably upgrade, my TV, right? Get like a 4K TV, maybe a smart TV, right? Um, and all that, right? But definitely just need more product on my shelf, right? So, out of the way. Let me continue with sort of unpacking this. So over the description again. So inherit the characteristics of a, quote, society, authority slash superior, ontological relativism, hate speech slash harmful rhetoric, etc. Quote, drive wedge society, right? Cause for violence, death threats, harassment, stalking, etc. Right? So, I mean, this, if you have two brain cells to rub together, as David Icke likes to say, you know, this is quite apropos when it comes to really investigating, the psychological milieu, right? You know, you'll generally encounter people who, you know, if not are actively campaigning to, or have, you know, sort of somehow work them way into a position where they are, you know, you'll find people who will, use these tactics to sort of gain favor from people, right? There have been a lot of very extensive um series, um, bodies of work, presentations, etc. You know, that discussions, interviews related to this issue, right? Um, you know, and it gets really illustrated through the lens of feminism a lot more, right? Where people will um, sort of point towards, feminism, right? Neo feminism, it's been called so many things, right? And then also its branches, of course, right? And, you know, um, we'll use these as examples of sort of this issue, right? But when it comes to really distilling it into its essence and really giving people firepower, right, to really navigate it when it comes to their own, personal life, right? Because, it's often been said, think global, act local, right? And, true words have never been spoken, right? Change starts from within, right? And so, you know, when your inside the world starts to change, the outside world will change, right? Um, and so, when it comes to really understanding sort of the effects that this dynamic has on society, you know, um, it's more from a personal perspective, and then also when it comes to your personal life and personal affairs, etc., that it really bleeds into, right? You'll find people who are just generally um, a lot more opportunistic than others, right? Generally because of the society. I mean, the again, what we're talking about here, right? The characteristics, that they've inherited, right? So it's something where you have to really keep your head on a swivel, right? Because um, when you're somebody who really is just again, right, what I call conducting internet oversight, right? These are things that are important to do, right? And they're important to do from a routine perspective, right? You don't necessarily have to try to sort of giving away trade secrets here, but you don't necessarily have to try to reinvent the wheel, right? Showing up sometimes is better than trying to get better results, for example. Um, and again, this is not the NFL, right? This is not MLS, right? If people don't like you, so what, right? You're not somebody who is exposed like that, where somehow people's because that generally has just to do with self esteem ultimately, right? Which is not an issue that most adults deal with, right? Most adults, will sort of find ways to sort of not develop self esteem and somehow be able to get through to adulthood, right? Um, and be able to mask their lack of self esteem with whatever means that they have acquired to do so, right? So generally, what you find with people in gaming is that when it comes to um, people liking them, that's not necessarily an issue that generally people encounter, right? People will tackle issues however they can, and they'll find their way through, right? And there's ups and downs, but you'll be able to conquer them if you try, right? And so when it comes to gaming, right, generally you don't find people have issues, particularly when it comes to you know, showing up, right? Um, you know, it's 2026, right? And so, you know, um, the Play Pokemon program, you know, has been, you know, it's gone through its ups and downs in the last few years, right? But it's definitely reaching a sort of peak, and it's reached a peak, in the last few years, right? With adjusting, prize pools, etc. Right? And so now people are becoming a lot more anxious and a lot more aggressive when it comes to trying to participate, right? And then also with just how quickly, particularly information about Pokemon spreads, right? Not necessarily information about the game itself, right? It's just about Pokemon in general. A lot more people are exposed to Pokemon, and a lot more people participate in playing games, right? And Pokemon, I call it gameplay because it is. um, than you would have had, 10 or 15 years ago, right? Where, there was no promotion, there wasn't all this huge social media, etc., right? And so as a result, right, you get issues where people become a lot more um, you know, authoritarian when it comes to sort of assessing, gaming, right? What we're talking about, with respect to this description, right? And so um, that's really what I mean by keeping your head on a swivel, right? Um, Again, right? Um, this show is not a show where you're just gonna be able to, you know, um, you know, tune in and receive everything you need to know, and then go about your day, right? You know, trying to really impart onto people that you really have to listen to what I'm saying, right? Go back, right? Because I'm not going to just repeat endlessly, right? Although even though that's what I'm just doing, right? Mr. Broken Record, right? But you know, um, you have to really investigate these dynamics, right? I'm speaking from a place of wisdom. I'm not speaking, like again, the show doesn't just represent me. Just turn on my microphone and webcam and just saying what's on my mind, right? I prepared for this month for the show alone, right? And so, you know, um, really want people to really investigate sort of kind of what I'm talking about here, right? So I'm going to leave it there for the former part of this episode. Um, and I'm just gonna close it for this episode. So it's been Mario Game Culture. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you.